Hello, everyone. Hi, Dolores. Hi, Kay. Kay greets me with the battle cry, austerity kills. That is true enough, Kay. So today, my main topic is going to be national debt, terrorism. It still is being practiced. It still is being practiced in the old way, and I'll be talking about that a little later. I did want to talk about a couple other things first. Hey, Russ, how are you? Great to see you here. Thank you for coming. Carmen says, ducking in. Hi, Dr. J. Hi, friends. So I wanted to share this article from, if my silly share screen will work here. I want to share this article from Counterpunch by Jonathan Latham called Agriculture's Greatest Myth. There are some people farming. This was done on April 15th by Counterpunch, and I believe it is native to Counterpunch. Sustainable, local, organic food grown on small farms has a tremendous amount to offer. Unlike chemical-intensive industrial-scale agriculture, it regenerates the rural communities. It doesn't pollute rivers and groundwater or create dead zones. It can save coral reefs. It doesn't encroach on forests, on rainforests, but it preserves soil, and it can restore the climate. Why do all governments not promote it? For policymakers, the big obstacle to global promotion and restoration of small-scale farming, leaving aside the lobbying power of agribusiness, is allegedly that, quote, it can't feed the world, unquote, quote. If that claim were true, local food systems would be bound to leave people hungry, and so promoting them becomes selfish, short-termist, and um, um, and also unethical. But nevertheless, this purported flaw in sustainable behavior in local agriculture represents a curious charge, because no matter where one looks in global agriculture, food prices are low because products are in surplus. Often they are in huge surplus, even in the hungriest countries. Farmers will tell you they're doing business because as a result of these surpluses, prices are low. They're going out of business because as a result of these surpluses, prices are low and continuously falling. Declining agricultural prices are a broad trend continuing with the odd blip for over a century and applying to every commodity. This downward trend has continued even through a recent biofuel boom designed to consume some of these surpluses. In other words, the available data contradict the likelihood of food shortages. Despite the rising global population, food gluts are everywhere. Obviously, not everywhere because we have starving people in the world. Global food models is the next section. The standard justification for claiming that these surpluses will one day turn into global food shortages comes from various mathematical models of the food system. These models are based on food production and other figures supplied to the United Nations by national governments, whereas anecdotal or local evidence is necessarily suspect. These models claim to be able to definitively assess and predict the enormous, diverse, and highly complex global food system. Most prominent and most widely cited of these food systems models is called GAPS, Global Agriculture Perspectives System. GAPS is a model created by researchers at the Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, in Rome. These models, and most often GAPS, are thus what is being cited in any quantitative discussion of future food needs. GAPS, for example, is the basis for the common 60% more food needed by 2050 prediction, what Britain's chief scientist John Beddington called, quote, a perfect storm, unquote, facing humanity. How reliable are these food system models? In 2010, Professor Thomas Hertel of Purdue gave the annual presidential address of the U.S. Agricultural and Applied Economics Association. He chose to discuss the ability of mathematical models like GAPS to predict future supplies. This work was subsequently published as Hertel 2011. Hertel told his audience that those models are faulty. What Hertel highlighted is that economic analysis has plainly shown that food supplies respond to long-term prices. That is, when prices for food items increase, food production also increases. For example, when prices increase, it becomes more worthwhile for farmers to invest in boosting their yields. But when prices are low, there is little such incentive. Other actors in the food system behave similarly. Yet global food models, noted Hertel, have adopted the opposite interpretation. They assume global food supplies are insensitive to prices. Sounds funny that some economist would assume that, right? In the firm but diplomatic tone expected of a presidential address, Hertel told his audience, quote, I fear that much of this rich knowledge has not yet worked its way into the global models being used for long-run analysis of climate, biofuels, and agricultural land use. It is not clear that the resulting models are well suited for the kind of long-run sustainability analysis envisioned here. This is rather important, since the whole point of these models is long-term prediction. If global food models underestimate the ability of food systems to adjust to higher demand, they will tend to predict a crisis even when there isn't one. Like all mathematical models, GAPS and other food system models incorporate numerous assumptions. These assumptions are typically shared across related models, which is why they tend to give similar answers. The reliability of all such models, therefore, depends crucially on the validity of shared assumptions like the one Hertel focused on. Hertel's analysis, therefore, prompts two important questions. The first is this. If GAPS contains an assumption that contradicts the collective wisdom of conventional agricultural economics, what other questionable assumptions hide in global food models? Surprisingly, though, given the stakes, scarcely any attention has been devoted to rigorous independent testing of these crucial assumptions. Second question is this. Is it significant that the error identified by Hertel will tend to generate predictions that are unnecessarily alarmist? In a new peer-reviewed paper, The Myth of a Food Crisis, I have critiqued FAO's GAPS and by extension all similar food system models at the level of these often unstated assumptions. This is in Latham, 2021. The myth of a food crisis identifies four assumptions in food system models that are especially problematic since they have major effects on the reliability of modeling predictions. In summary, these are: 1. That biofuels are driven by demand. As the paper shows, biofuels are incorporated into GAPS on the demand side of equations. However, biofuels derive from lobbying efforts. They exist to solve the problem of agricultural oversupply. Since biofuels contribute little or nothing to sustainability, land use for them is available to feed populations if needed. This potential availability, e.g. 40% of U.S. corn, is used for corn ethanol. Makes it plainly wrong for GAPS to treat biofuels as an unavoidable demand on production. That current agricultural production systems are optimized for productivity. As the paper also shows, agricultural systems are typically not optimized to maximize calories or nutrients. Usually they optimize profits or sometimes subsidies with very different results. For this reason, practically all agricultural systems could produce many more nutrients per acre at no ecological cost if desired. 3. That crop yield potentials have been correctly estimated. Using the example of rice, the paper shows that some farmers, even under suboptimal conditions, achieve yields far in excess of those considered possible by GAPS. Thus, the yield ceilings assumed by GAPS are far too low for rice and probably other crops too. Therefore, GAPS grossly underestimates agricultural potential. And four, that annual global food production is approximately equal to global food consumption. As the paper also shows, a significant proportion of global food production ends up in storage where it degrades and is disposed of without ever being counted by GAPS. There is thus a very large accounting hole in GAPS. The specific ways in which these four assumptions are incorporated into GAPS and other models introduces one of two main effects. Each causes GAPS to either underestimate global food supply now and in the future, and to overestimate global food demand now and in the future. Well, I guess it looks like the GAPS model is crap. Thus, GAPS and other models underestimate supply and exaggerate demand. The cumulative effect is dramatic. Using peer-reviewed data, the discrepancy between food availability estimated by GAPS and the underlying supply is calculated in the paper. Such calculations show that GAPS and other models omit approximately enough food annually to feed 12.5 billion persons. This is a lot of food, but it does perfectly explain why the models are so discrepant with policymakers and farmers' consistent experiences of the food system. In other words, their subjective experiences are that there's too much food, prices are too low, and they cannot make a profit. Not even that. They're going out of business. So, the consequences of this analysis are very significant on a number of fronts. There is no global shortage of food. Even under any plausible future population scenario or potential increases in wealth, the current global glut will not disappear due to elevated demand. Among the many implications of this glut is, other things being equal, global commodity prices will continue to decline. The potential caveat emptor to this analysis or this narrative is climate chaos. Climate consequences are not factored into this analysis. However, for people who think that industrial agriculture is the solution to that problem, it is worth recalling that industrialized food systems are the leading emitter of carbon dioxide. Industrializing food production is therefore not the solution to climate change, it is the problem. Another significant implication of this analysis is to remove the justification for the frequently suggested adoption of special and sacrificial sustainable intensification measures featuring intensive use of pesticides, GMOs, and gene-edited organisms to boost food production. What is needed to save rainforests and other habitats from agricultural expansion is instead to reduce the subsidies and incentives that are responsible for overproduction and unsustainable practices. In this way, harmful agricultural policies can be replaced by ones guided by criteria such as ecological sustainability and cultural appropriateness. A second implication stems from asking if the models err on such elementary levels, why are critics largely absent? Thomas Hurtel's critique should have rung alarm bells. The short answer is that the philanthropic and academic sectors in agriculture and development are corrupt. Wow. The form this corruption takes is not illegality, rather that, with important exceptions, these sectors do not serve the public interest, but their own interests. A good example is the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, which created GAPS. The primary mandate, of FAO is to enable food production. Its motto is fiat panis, but without an actual or imminent food crisis, there would hardly be a need for an FAO. Many philanthropic and academic institutions are equally conflicted. It is no accident that all the critics mentioned above are relative or complete outsiders. Too many participants in the food system depend on a crisis narrative. But the biggest factor of all in promotion of the crisis is agribusiness. Agribusiness is the entity most threatened by its the exposure of agribusiness. And then he shows an ad from Syngenta, which is the company referred to in agribusiness. Working at Syngenta, you help us accelerate innovation for more sustainable agriculture so farmers can grow safe and nutritious food to feed a growing population and take care of the planet. It is agribusiness that perpetuates the myth most actively and makes use of it by endlessly championing itself as the only valid bulwark against starvation. It is agribusiness that most aggressively alleges. That most aggressively alleges that all other forms of agriculture are inadequate. This Malthusian specter is a good story. It's had a tremendous run, but it's just not true. By exposing it, we can free up agriculture to work for everyone, which is, of course, a happy thought, were it only a matter of dispelling myth. Of course, we have a similar problem in the field of economics and fiscal policy. If it only just a simple matter of debunking the myths. Okay, I'll stop sharing that and now take us to the major topic of the evening, which is the debt, terrorism. Oops, sorry. That's the one. I think I'm sharing the wrong screen, sorry. There it is. Let's go to the top. This is from the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. What is the national debt today? See it ticking away, ticking away. 28 trillion, 145 billion, 570,000. No, wait a minute, sorry. 28 trillion, 145 billion, 570 million, 900, I'm sorry, 185,000 and 952. It's already, as I say it, it skips. Now, aren't you scared? That's 85,241 for every single person in America. Never mind that we as individuals ever contracted to pay back the debt or to pay down the debt. So why does the average debt actually matter? Why does it actually matter? Could it be that the wealthiest of Americans want to pay down the debt for exactly the same amount of money as the very poorest Americans do? Are they really arguing that, first of all, it's got to be paid back, and secondly, that Bill Gates owes 85,241 of it, while Joe Firestone also owes 85,241? In a pig's eye. In a pig's eye. I never contracted to pay as much as the next guy. I never contracted to pay for this debt at all. It was the government that contracted to pay this debt. So what does it matter if it's 85,241 per person? And by the way, who says that anybody has to pay this down? Who says that it has to be paid back? Who says the mere existence of the national debt today is a problem for anybody? Who says that? Who are they? Well, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation is a nonprofit, 501c3, but it's one that was founded by a billionaire and is now run by a board, the most influential member of which is the son of the late Peter G. Peterson. That is Michael Peterson. And he wants you to know that all of you owe $85,241. But where is the legal evidence that you do? And where is the evidence that this has to be paid for by taxes? And just ignoring all that, why is the national debt so high? First of all, it is so high. And second of all, why is it bad that it's so high? Maybe it's good. They say there's a mismatch. It's the result of simple math each year. There's a mismatch between spending and revenues. But that, my friends, is the deficit. That's the deficit. That's not the debt. But in the next sentence, they say, when the federal government spends more than it takes in, we have to borrow money to cover that annual deficit. Well, of course, there is that old saying, not me, white man. But that's, of course, the Lone Ranger's joke. I don't want people to get offended. It's the Lone Ranger joke. The point being, we don't have to borrow money. The United States doesn't have to issue debt instruments and sell those debt instruments like a bank sells certificates of deposit. The federal government doesn't have to do that. It chooses to do that. Where is it said that Congress has to make the executive branch do that? It doesn't say that. In fact, there's a law that says that the executive branch has the power to mint 1-ounce platinum coins with face values to be determined at the discretion of the secretary. With that kind of power, there's no need at all to borrow money to cover the annual deficit. Just use that power. If you got a problem with using that power, then why don't you, Congress, just order the Federal Reserve to top up the Treasury spending account with the amount needed to spend an appropriation, to spend each appropriation of Congress during each fiscal year. If that little boilerplate is in the bill, then there'll never be a need to borrow money again. Guess what kind of implicit assumption is made here as well? The implicit assumption, of course, is that the amount of the deficit is going to equal the amount of the debt. But if Congress is doing overt congressional financing, or the Treasury Department using its power to mint coinage of very high face value, if these powers are taken advantage of, then not all the money out there would be covered by borrowed money. Obviously, the deficit wouldn't be the same as the debt, because conceptually, they're two different ideas. The deficit idea is taxes minus spending. And the debt idea is selling debt instruments with the value of the debt being the cumulative face values of all the debt instruments that are sold and that have not yet been redeemed. Two different ideas, two different concepts. No necessity for them to be equal, except our very old practices that seem to require, but do not, in the face of legislation, that those two figures be equal. PGPF says historically, Our largest deficits were caused by increased spending around national emergencies like major wars or the Great Depression. Today, our deficits are caused mainly by predictable structural factors: our aging baby boom generation, rising healthcare costs, and a tax system that does not bring in enough money to pay for what the government has promised its citizens. How insightful. Our deficits are caused mainly by predictable structural factors. But structural factors are not predictable if we change those particular structural factors. In fact, we could change current law without it being a change in the structural factors. And it would then not necessarily be the case that our deficits were caused mainly by predictable structural factors. In this case, it's probably historically true they were, but those factors are just something we're going to go on with into the future. And the assumption is made, of course, that there will be no change. But the first thing mentioned after that statement is a change. The coronavirus has accelerated an already unsustainable fiscal trajectory, both because of its devastating effect on the economy and the necessary legislative response. But here's the coronavirus. It did accelerate, disturb, disrupt the fiscal trajectory, whether it was unsustainable or not unsustainable. If there were an unsustainability about it, then coronavirus would have been a huge tragedy for the fiscal trajectory. But nobody seems to feel very much sense of tragedy, either in Washington, D.C. or in the country at large. The coronavirus has accelerated an already unsustainable trajectory, both because of its devastating effect on the economy and the necessary legislative response. Once we have emerged from the pandemic, it will be critical for America's leaders to address our rising debt and its structural factors, which are described below. Now, we'll go through the structural factors for a minute, and then we're going to ask, are these the only structural factors? Here is our debt over time. This is supposedly a structural factor. Okay, our debt is growing very, very rapidly. It went up here, and the actual debt to GDP ratio in 2019 was 79%. Well, if it continues on the trajectory it had been before 2019, it would be at 202% in 2051. Now, what I'm going to say is this: is that all? Only 202% in 2051? We're never even going to catch the Japanese. Why is that good news? We won't be number one. Three major drivers of our growing national debt. One is demographics. Folks, we just got too many old people. Our society is aging as the large baby boom generation begins to retire. 10,000 will turn 65 every day through 2029. Moreover, people are expected to live longer on average. That is great news, but it means we must prepare for the financial needs of a longer retirement. Why does that sound so obvious to us? Well, who's the we? I mean, who's the we? Yes, we as individuals must privately prepare before retirement. And we must prepare because we're not the issuers of the currency. We must prepare by saving for retirement. However, the government is the big issuer of the currency. So maybe the government should be preparing for the longer retirement of people by providing them with a nest egg before the big problem with retirement gets much worse. Top up the bank accounts of people over 65 continuously by the month. And then they will be much better prepared to retire. I guarantee it. Who's we? The obvious meaning is, well, both ourselves, okay, and our government. Right? Because our government has the same financial powers we have. Right? Impossible for the government to do anything that I can't do, right? Except, of course, for Article 1, what's in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, including the capability to coin money and, by interpretation of the Supreme Court, to create money in other ways as well. These huge demographic trends, only one mention here, somehow, is the aging people. I won't say the old people, out of deference to myself, but the aging people. These huge demographic trends, and in particular on vital programs that serve older and vulnerable Americans like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And there's the projected growth of the senior population by 2060. Who thinks there are going to be 94.7 million seniors in 2060 if people start to drop like flies because we fail to make our pollution targets by 2050? How come we project this curve out regardless of what's happening on the climate front? How come we simply assume that the percent of the senior population or the amount of the senior population is going to grow as we go up the scale, as it has been, regardless of what's happened in the area of climate change and pollution of the environment with greenhouse gases? So that's all. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Demographics is point one in driving the national debt. Point two is rising healthcare costs. Bonnie says, whose fault is that? It's people who very often are in friendly conferences with Peter G. Peterson personnel. In many ways, healthcare is the most important issue for our nation's fiscal and economic future. It represents nearly 1/5 of our entire economy, and it is the fastest growing part of the budget. The healthcare system is the most expensive in the world. But we don't really get what we pay for. We spend 3 times as much on healthcare as other advanced nations. But our system does not provide better overall health outcomes. Improving the performance of the U.S. healthcare system will not only improve American lives, it will help stabilize our fiscal and economic outlook. Look at these healthcare costs per person, around the world in 2019. Not all around the world, but in selected countries. All of those countries, are OECD countries, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And so there's Spain at $3,616 per person. Second cheapest is the UK, $4,653 per person. Japan, $4,822 per person. France, $53.75. Australia, $51.87. Canada, $54.18. Germany, $66.45. Switzerland, $7,732. OECD average, $4,033 per person. And there is America, the United States of, at $11,071 per person. Total healthcare expenditures in 2019. If I recall correctly, I'm not going to have to recall anything here. Let's just say that since 2019, our healthcare expenditures per person have increased by a considerable amount, both in absolute terms and as a percentage, of GDP. I think in terms of average per person, we're probably looking like more roughly $12,500 per person right now. So even more. Yes, all in all, maybe about 3 times the OECD average, or close to 3 times the OECD average. However, I thought we were talking about the national debt, specifically the debt subject to the limit for the federal government. Here we're talking about the expenditures per person. Surely all the expenditures per person but within the United States are not those of the federal government, are they? There are such things as the premiums and co-pays, also deductibles that we pay or not pay, as the case may be. So even not talking about taxes or anything like that, which we would argue that we don't actually pay for, but simply money that comes out of our private pockets to go to another private sector pocket. There is still perhaps a third of expenditures per person that are coming out of one private sector pocket and going into another private sector pocket. It happens to be the case, though, that 2/3 of the total expenditures have actually been traced to the federal government in a study done a few years ago. So government spending does have something to do with healthcare costs. Okay, specifically because the government is spending an awful lot of those, but is not doing very much to control them, in spite of its heavy role in the finance. And three, what else is driving the debt? Well, the tax code is not really designed to fund all the promises we're making. They tell us taxism doesn't generate enough revenues to cover the spending policymakers have enacted. This rapidly growing imbalance between revenues and spending leads to higher and higher annual deficits, and the result is an increasing national debt balance. Oh, how terrible. Here it is, 2022, federal revenues and spending. It's 2020, sorry. $3.42 trillion total revenues, $6.55 trillion. More than $2 trillion. More than $2 trillion of deficit, which of course resulted in an additional $2.2 trillion being floated. So how is that hurting us? Well, what is the national debt actually costing us? Well, you see, as the debt grows, so does the interest we pay. Does the interest I pay grow? Does the interest you pay grow? Does the interest paid by the guy over there under the tree go? No. The interest is paid as part of federal spending. Necessary money for it is appropriated by the Congress. And then the Treasury gets its account filled, in the usual ways, which until very recently have involved essentially refills by the Federal Reserve of the Treasury account occurring when tax revenues and bond revenues are settled. But that, as we know, is not something necessary. It's been imposed. It's a matter, of policy. Every day we spend nearly $1 billion on interest. I know this is going to be hard for you to believe, but in the early days of the Clinton administration, we were paying something in the neighborhood of $500 to $600 billion per year. That's almost $2 billion a day, on interest. And how did that hurt us? I suppose it hurt us because the austerity guys got more powerful and were able to scare people into continuously underspending throughout most of the Clinton administration, thereby forcing us to go to private lenders to be able to sustain our spending. Anyway, they're trying to tell people, $1 billion on interest is just a huge amount, when it was nearly twice as much during the early 90s. And we didn't have any problem handling it, that I recall. But interest will become the fastest growing part of the federal budget. In 10 years, our interest will double from where it is today. I have to remind everybody, this is a projection. And it's a projection based on both current law and current practices. In the case of having to borrow or sell debt instruments to refill the Treasury spending account, that's what we've done in the past. It's not at all what we have to do in the future constitutionally, or what the executive branch has to have us do, since it has a policy alternative, that of implementing the authority to create platinum coins and use the coin seigniorage as the way of paying a part of the national debt. So there's rising interest in the budget, in the projections, and then the vast majority of Americans believe that addressing our debt should be a priority. What can we do? Tweet at your rep. Now, what do I have to say about all this? Well, the first thing I have to say is that debt number, that's a really, really big number. That 85,241 is also a really, really, really big number. But this is what I want to know. This is what I want to know. I've heard of something in economics called sectoral balances. And the sectoral balances basically say, since the amount of money that is transacted each year, that is equal to the GDP, the amount of transacting, that's going on, is roughly let's say now it's probably $22.5 trillion or something like that, or $23 trillion. Okay. So when you look at that total amount of transactions, and you decide to classify the net of the transactions, it turns out that the net of the transactions, the net of the transactions going from one sector of the economy to other sectors of the economy at the same level of analysis, is zero. Because it's like a pie getting divvied up, completely divvied up, among the sectors. Once that happens, there is nothing left over. So the sum of those quantities has to be zero. Now, it's conventional to divide the dollar economy each year, the dollar transactions that go on and make up the GDP, into three sectors: a foreign sector, also a domestic non-government sector, and a private sector. Those are the three sectors whose trade transactions have to sum to zero. So if one sector is gaining on the others, and its transactions are above zero, a positive, then one or two of the other sectors, depending on how things are distributed, would have to be negative. In other words, the two together must be a negative sum. which is equal, okay, in terms of the numbers, but opposite, okay, in sign. So if there's a sector, like let's say the government sector, that has a positive of 150 billion, then the private sector and the foreign sector together are going to have a deficit for that year of 250 billion. Now this can be distributed, okay, in various ways. The foreign sector could be positive by 450 billion. If that were the case, then the private sector would be negative for that year, and its negative value would have to be the sum of 650 and 250, which is 900 billion. So, why is the national debt so high? Well, let us note that the fact that it is so high, that it's at $28 trillion right now, tells us that the federal government is spending more into the non-government sector than it is taking in. Than it is taking in from the foreign sector, than it is taking in from the domestic sector. So that is what is happening. The government's deficit and the government's debt, because we always cover those deficits with the sale of debt instruments, so cumulatively, we have given $28 trillion. $28 trillion in government currency to the non-government sector. That is the accumulation of still outstanding debt instruments. The federal government is the cumulative contribution of the federal government to the non-government sector. That's it. So what is that 28 trillion? It means the government has been so generous. It has given out $28 trillion. Now, we might think it's not being so generous because of the way it gives out the $28 trillion. But the very idea that the private sector as a whole has benefited by $28 trillion. If the private sector were a real person rather than just an aggregate, then the private sector would be saying, let's celebrate. Let's have a big party. We've got $28 trillion over on the government all these years. Why aren't we celebrating? The national debt clock is really the national, not government, savings clock, isn't it? So why shouldn't we be celebrating these last years in America when the debt has been going up so fast? And why shouldn't we celebrate that our debt to GDP ratio is going to be 202% in 2051? Because based on the same way of doing things staying around until then, we will have placed 202% of net financial assets into the private sector. That would be cause for celebration. We grew in 32 years from getting 79% of GDP from the government to getting 202%. 202% as the ratio, okay, of debt to the GDP. Isn't that wonderful? We're doing so much better each year. That's cause for celebration. Why isn't that cause for celebration? Why isn't it cause for celebration? Because the Peter G. Peterson Foundation is assuming the only way to pay this off is by taxing people in the non-government sector. That, okay, is why. But that is an assumption. That is not something we have to do. And what if we did it and then we distributed it? Well, I shouldn't say we can't really distribute it, but what if we did it by taxing, then we issued an equal amount of currency to users, and that changed the distribution of the 202%, okay, of GDP to entirely different quarters than it exists in right now. What would be wrong with that? We'd still be at 202% of GDP, right? Well, maybe not. And rising healthcare costs. Would rising healthcare costs have the same impact? Not really, because it might be in the future that the government changes something structurally by having a Medicare for All program. And then there would be very little out-of-pocket private sector expenses going on. All the expenses would be borne by the government, but they might be no greater than today, because the government might be able to cut down the cost per person by a third. Who knows? But maybe that's the case. Actually, many people know, and many people know pretty well, that is likely to be the case. Okay. So, there are these wonderful factors causing the debt to rise and the interest bill to grow higher and higher, supposedly, even though it's lower than it was, as I said, in the early 1990s. It certainly is lower as a percent, okay, of GDP than it was then, but it's even lower in absolute numbers, way lower, okay, in absolute numbers. So why does the national debt matter? Well, in truth, the size of the national debt doesn't matter, because the United States is a currency issuer, and however high the debt gets, the United States can always pay for it as it falls due, along with the necessary interest payments. So the debt is increasing, but the power of the government to pay the costs of the debt remains unchanged. The power is written into the Constitution. And Congress, it doesn't matter, can find a way to pay those debts, whether or not it taxes us, whether or not it taxes us a particular amount, okay, as opposed to another amount. I'm sure it has to tax us something to keep driving the value of the money. But within that particular statement, there's a whole range of balance of taxing to simply creating money that could exist and that could be a matter, okay, of policy. All the vast majority of Americans want to know is that paying our debt is not going to be a problem because of the power to issue currency. In fact, we can now look at the real underlying cause of the national debt itself and of the size of that particular debt. And what is the cause of that? And whose fault is that? This is a cause that you'll never see mentioned by the Peterson Foundation. And the cause simply is that the government of the United States, including the Congress of the United States, refuses to pay the debt as it falls due out of money it has created without issuing any further debt. It's because, in other words, the Congress and the executive branch have decided that in order to pay the national debt, they will use the triggering mechanism that now exists at the Federal Reserve to refill the Treasury spending account when tax payments are settled or when payments for security are settled. When those transactions are settled at the Fed, there is a convention that the Treasury spending account will then be credited with the same amount of newly created reserves. But what Congress has decided to do is just a matter of choice. What the executive branch has decided to do is just a matter of choice. The executive branch can choose to pay down the national debt or pay off the national debt as it falls due, as well as the interest payments by minting platinum coins and depositing them at the Fed. And the Congress is also at fault because it can afford to put two sentences into all of the appropriations bills that order the Federal Reserve to deposit the amount of reserves that are projected to be necessary to spend congressional appropriations and to pay off the debt that falls due. Congress can give the Federal Reserve specific orders to fill the Treasury spending account with that amount of the reserves it is supposed to spend. So, what is the biggest factor in back of having a national debt? That neither the executive branch will do its part, nor will the congressional branch do its part and allow those things to happen. And so I say this to the Peter G. Peterson Foundation and to all the other debt hawks, okay, and terrorists, and to all of the other people who are constantly preaching austerity. If the national debt means so much to you, why don't you advocate for the Treasury Department to pay the current outstanding debt and also to issue a sufficient amount of coinage so all future deficits can be covered as they occur in each year. So the bottom line is what the Peterson Foundation is assuming is that the executive branch will never do its duty and just eradicate the national debt, and that Congress will never do its duty, okay, and just eradicate the national debt. Now, am I really saying that Congress, okay, is obligated in some sense to do this? Or that the executive branch is obligated to do this? I'm not saying they're obligated from a financial point of view, because they are not from a financial point of view. From a financial point of view, if you want to stop worrying about crises the national debt can cause, all you have to do is repeal the debt ceiling law. That's all you have to do. Get rid of that. And then there'll be no further problems with the national debt in terms of the level of the national debt somehow impacting on Treasury's ability to spend. Because that is a bottleneck. It is a political bottleneck. You can get rid of it in an afternoon by repealing the debt ceiling law. Yes, you can. But if that's not your worry, if the debt itself really means something to you, just as a number, just as a thing, you don't want the Treasury to issue any more debt instruments anymore because you don't like those. And that really bothers you. It sticks in your craw. If it's really that important to you, use the platinum coin law or use overt congressional financing language in appropriations bills. Either way, you will be guaranteeing that the national debt be paid for as it falls due each year, that the interest will be paid for as it falls due each year, and that any additional deficit to be incurred in each year will be taken care of by topping up the Treasury general account, that is the Treasury spending account, with reserves created by the Fed in response to Congress or in response to platinum coins that were minted, that were issued, that were issued and were deposited at the Fed. If you care so much about it, advocate for that. If you care so much about it, put those two sentences into all the appropriations bills this year. That is the way to handle the national debt. And that is a way that will make it very, very clear that the national debt clock is a national savings clock. And will, by the way, also make it very, very clear that the national savings clock and the national debt clock don't have to be the same. That if we decouple the two and begin to create currency without issuing corresponding amounts of debt, then the non-government savings over time will be different from the accumulation of the debt instruments over time. Those will become very low and finally will go away, while the deficits will remain, and it will be clear to everyone that those deficits are contributions to the non-government sector, and therefore are in the aggregate to be celebrated. Now, as individuals, we might not happen to celebrate them because of the way that they have currently been distributed throughout our society. And the distribution problem is also a problem for our elected representatives in the executive branch, okay, and in the legislative branch to begin to manage, because at that, both branches have done a terrible job over the last 45 years, a highly discreditable job. That's all I'm going to say about that. So I had intended to handle a couple of other things today, but I got so happy about talking about the debt and the deficit and austerity again, and what these hypocrites could do if they really cared about the debt, that I just got a little carried away. Okay, I hope you like that. I will now turn to your comments. And I thank you for coming here too, and for being here too. And so Russ said, hey, Dr. Joe. We went over that. And Teresa Sanders says, hey, Doc, everybody. Kay says, shared. Alana said, I didn't see any announcement. Oh, sorry, Lana. It hit, you should have, I'm sure you have the announcement as Joe's work team. But anyway, here we are. Carmen says, I've started saving my canned beans, veggies, and fruit from the food bank. So I recently read the worst drought in 1,200 years will hit this nation this year. Hope no, hope not. Deborah said, yeah, no notification. I was just surfing my YouTube and saw you alive. Well, thank you for coming, Deborah. I'm sorry about the notification tonight. We were out for dinner for a while, and when we came back, I was a bit hurried in my preparations. Not too much. Kay says, plus we get better food. It's been a very long time since we went out for dinner. We had an offer we couldn't refuse. It was a free appetizer with a main meal. And what we did is we got the free appetizer, we ordered one main meal, which we split, and we came home totally stuffed. Yeah. You'll find that as you get older, just don't eat as much. At least some people just don't eat as much. Kay says, Evelina, we're on. Bonnie says, hi, everyone. Kay says, they're barking up the wrong tree with me, laugh out loud. Carmen says, well, as long as I owe them, they'll never be broke. Lana says, I am out food shopping, but hello, all. I can understand food shopping. Carmen says, guys, don't go on any cruises. Norovirus is said to be a superbug now. Don't worry, Carmen. There's no possibility we're going to go on any cruises anytime soon. No matter how good the deals. And, okay, I still got Carmen there. Oh, I see. Carmen said hi. And ever since then, I've kept that comment on the screen. Sorry. Kay says they don't want people to know about that. I'm sure they don't. Jim says, who has the money to go on cruises? I don't know. I have no idea. Comment says, folks are itching to go here in Florida to the point that Death Santis is suing Biden and the CDC to relax the COVID rules. Kay says, invest in the IRS so they can afford to go after rich tax cheats. Yeah, we ought to do that because democracy can't afford those guys. Kay says, you can't save for retirement when you are a low-wage worker, especially women. Well, you do save some for retirement because of the payroll taxes that you pay. Of course, there's no dollar-for-dollar match, but you know what I mean. Russell says you can't save for retirement when the economy crashes and takes 7+ years to come back. 7+ years to come back? Hasn't the economy taken to come back since 2008, taken 13+ years to come back? It's never really come back, in my view. At least not in terms of an economy that was good for everybody or for most people. Carmen says, Russ, I have my jasmine tea right here. Are you having tea right now too? Steve Gonzo says, a national debt terrorism clock on Eastern Standard Time. But a reporter can't lift his camera after being shot with rubber bullets covering Brooklyn Center protests. They've targeted press, the medics, even a church harboring injured while blocking EMT's entry. That's amazing. That's really amazing. I saw a Twitter feed today that talked about Lincoln's use of greenbacks to pay for the Civil War. Someone had a competent understanding of state money creation. Yeah, they probably read the Constitution, Russ. They know that Congress has the power. Let's do it. Cases, we spend all that money per person and still have no real health care, only sick care. Russell said, hell, when I go to the doctor, I never see a doctor. I haven't seen a doctor in 5 years. Russell says PGPF is total garbage. Yes. Still total garbage. I mean, I think it's time for Michael Peterson to change his tune. His father, is laid to rest. They shouldn't be doing the same old thing. They should be talking about real fiscal responsibility, which is using fiscal tools to achieve the public purpose. Kay says, I'm just going to go to the local hospital clinic and see a nurse. Kay says, doctors seem to be the big pharma drug pushers these days. Nurses usually care more for the patients. Yes, I agree. Nurses do seem to care more for the patients. And Rahul Majumdar says, national debt equals private sector and personal wealth and savings. The cumulative principle of national debt instruments not yet redeemed equals private sector wealth savings in money that has been issued by the United States. Kay says, good report, Joe. What do you mean, good report? Kay, what do you mean, good report? Who else would tell you not only to be jolly, but also that if these damn people wanted to, they can take care of the debt. They can set in an automatic mechanism to take care of the debt as it falls due in perpetuity that will always work. It could be handled by computer. It isn't difficult. And Russell says, that reminds me, I should go brew a nice cup of my favorite oolong tea. That sounds pretty good, Russ. Pretty good indeed. Okay, folks, I hope you enjoyed into this excursion into my brand, okay, of MMT. I don't think everybody has quite the same brand. I think I'm in the mainstream of MMT, certainly. But I think that all of the MMTers have a little bit different interpretation. Kay says, that's what I mean, Joe. That's okay, Kay. Okay, so if you have some comments or questions, okay, I'm taking them. Meanwhile, I'm going to finish my 1 ounce of wine. That goes just fine. Okay, folks. So Dolores says, thank you and good night all. And Russ says, I wish that they would be more active about implementing the coin. Yes, so do I, of course. And of course, in the Automatic Booster Communities Act, which has been reissued by this year, I keep on forgetting the number of it. I have to look it up again. It does pay for the $2,000 a month of basic income. By using the platinum coin. Kay says, thank you for another great discussion. I missed these when you were off. I love you all. We love you today. Carmen Muniz says, Dr. J has the Hulk brand of MMT. It was smashing tonight. Thank you, Carmen. Carmen says, angels on your pillows tonight. Sleep well. Same to everybody. Bonnie and I are going to go call our daughter in California. I'll see you soon. Take care. Have a great weekend.